He sprawls on scorching desert ground, abandoned by the one who should have protected him, and every rasping breath battles the fever tearing through his frail body. A lone horse appears on the horizon, hinting at a salvation he never believed could exist. Under the relentless glare of midday sun, the desert appeared vast and unforgiving. Waves of heat shimmered above the cracked earth, while distant rock formations trembled in the scorching haze. In that empty expanse, a lone figure lay sprawled beneath a faded blanket, barely conscious. The boy's face was sunburned, his lips cracked, and his breathing faint. 15-year-old Jonah had once been full of spark, but illness had ravaged his small body. Now, feverish and dehydrated, he hovered between fitful dreams and the merciless reality of being stranded in a wasteland. Nothing could have prepared him for the betrayal that had brought him here. After losing his mother, Jonah had held out hope that his stepfather might care for him despite the constant tension in their home. Instead, in a moment of cold calculation, his stepfather had dumped him in the middle of nowhere, driving away without a backward glance. A meager gust of wind swept across the boy's cheeks, adding grainy flecks of sand to his already parched skin. Jonah tried to open his eyes, but the brightness made them sting. Soft moans escaped his cracked lips, yet there was no one to hear him. He thought he had seen it all when he lost his mother, but this abandonment felt worse than anything he could have imagined. As the hours dragged on, he felt his strength draining. Lightheaded from fever, Jonah wondered if this scorching place would be his final resting spot. Each breath felt heavier than the last, the desert's silence broken only by the occasional rasp of wind over the dunes. His head pulsed with pain, and sometimes he thought he heard whispers, though he could see no one. Slowly, he drifted into a fever dream, not knowing if he would ever wake. A memory flickered behind Jonah's closed eyelids, his mother smiling and placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, telling him to be brave whenever life tested him. He clung to that memory like a fragile lifeline. Her face hovered in his mind, giving him the smallest spark of hope. Yet hope was a fickle thing in the searing desert heat. Every time Jonah tried to summon the will to rise, his body failed him. The sun marched across the sky, each minute passing with punishing monotony. There was no shade, no respite, no voice to offer comfort, just endless dunes and a ragged boy too weak to move. Hours later, though it felt like days, Jonah's eyes snapped open to a different sound, a rhythm that stood apart from the hush of desert winds. It was the soft thud of hooves against the packed sand. At first, Jonah wondered if this, too, was part of his fevered dreams. Hallucinations had come and gone, often taking the form of phantom rescue. Sometimes he thought he heard his mother calling his name, other times the rumble of an approaching car. But this sounded too solid, too real to ignore. Summoning the dregs of his strength, he raised his head and squinted against the brightness. In the distance, a dark shape drew closer. Jonah blinked repeatedly, unable to believe his eyes. It was a horse, moving with a languid yet purposeful gait, mane tossing gently in the desert breeze. This horse was unlike any Jonah had seen. Sturdy yet somehow gaunt around the ribs, it bore signs of a rough life, with scars on its flanks and a coat dusty from travel. And yet there was a certain nobility in its posture, something defiant in the tilt of its head. As it approached, Jonah tried to speak but managed only a hoarse croak. The horse paused, ears twitching at the weak sound, then took a cautious step forward. For a moment, boy and animal simply regarded each other amid that sweltering silence. Jonah was too delirious to grasp how improbable this encounter was, yet he felt an odd comfort in the horse's presence. Eventually, the horse let out a quiet snort. Moving closer, it sniffed at the ragged blanket draped over Jonah's body. The boy coughed, trying to form words of reassurance that he meant no harm. He didn't understand why the animal was here, or if it even understood his pitiful murmurs. He only knew that a flicker of life stirred inside him when he realized he was no longer alone. The horse nudged Jonah's shoulder gently, as if testing whether this strange figure in the sand might rise. Jonah tried once more to push himself onto his elbows, but dizziness overtook him, and he collapsed back with a pained gasp. In his cloudy state, Jonah recalled something his mother used to say about the resilience of desert creatures, that the desert could be harsh and unyielding. But those who called it home carried a rare toughness in their souls. Perhaps this horse had wandered across many miles of burning sand and was simply curious about the bundle of cloth and flesh lying in its path. Or perhaps fate had guided it here, though Jonah scarcely dared to hope for such a miracle. Regardless, the horse lingered, pawing the ground as though uncertain what to do next. Time blurred. Jonah drifted in and out of consciousness, each return to awareness marked by the same unwavering presence of the horse. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep purple. Jonah's eyelids fluttered as twilight descended. The cooler evening air offered relief, yet the boy's fever still raged, leaving him shivering under the tattered blanket. Through the haze, he felt a sudden soft brush against his cheek. With trembling fingers, he reached up and touched something solid and warm. It was the horse's muzzle, pressed gently to his skin. The gesture sparked a surge of emotion in Jonah's chest, a mix of gratitude, wonder, and sorrow. Had the horse come to say goodbye? Or was it an attempt at offering comfort? Jonah managed a weak smile, though tears pricked at his eyes. He wanted to speak, to say something like, "Thank you," or "Don't leave me," but his throat was too dry. The horse pulled away and sniffed at the canteen that Jonah's stepfather had callously tossed aside before driving off. There was no water left inside, just a pitiful trickle that had evaporated in the scorching heat. Jonah felt the stir of panic in his stomach. Without water, he knew he wouldn't last. Then came the night, mercifully cooler, but still wrought with danger. Coyotes and other nocturnal creatures prowled, sometimes howling in the distance. The stars glistened overhead, indifferent to the drama unfolding on the desert floor. Jonah's fever spiked again, and in his delirium he imagined forms dancing among the rocks, conjured from his darkest fears. But whenever he managed to lift his head, the silhouette of the horse stood vigil, not wandering far. Its shape against the moonlight gave Jonah an odd sense of security, as though a guardian spirit watched over him in these final hours of despair. As the sky paled toward dawn, Jonah could no longer distinguish dream from reality. He thought he heard voices, a man's voice, deep and urgent, and the nervous whinny of the horse. Grains of sand dug into his skin as he tried to roll onto his side. Pain flared through him, but a pair of strong hands suddenly braced his shoulders. He moaned, confused and disoriented. A blurred face hovered above him, speaking words he didn't understand. From the corner of his vision, Jonah saw the horse pacing anxiously, kicking up dust with its hooves. He blinked, trying to focus. Who was this stranger bending over him? The man wore a wide-brimmed hat, and his clothing suggested a ranch hand or a traveler. His gruff voice cut through the haze. "Easy, son," Jonah thought he heard. "I got you." The horse gave a sharp snort as the man lifted Jonah's head and held a small flask to his lips. Water, a miraculous trickle, spilled into Jonah's mouth, and though it was warm and tasted of old metal, it felt like life itself. Jonah coughed, sputtering in shock, but he swallowed each precious drop as if it were a gift from heaven. He wanted to speak, to ask who this man was, how he had found him, but his thoughts collapsed into grateful submission. The man turned briefly to the horse, patting its flank. "Good job, boy," Jonah heard him say, and for an instant, everything clicked in his mind. The horse had somehow led this stranger to Jonah's side. Maybe it had gone searching for help, or maybe this man had been following the horse's tracks. Either way, Jonah's eyes brimmed with tears as he realized that the horse had done what no human had, cared enough to save him. Weak as he was, Jonah felt a surge of raw emotion welling in his throat. Memories of his stepfather's sneering face, the harsh words that still echoed in Jonah's ears, all of it tumbled into a whirl of anger and sorrow. But overshadowing that bitterness was a warmth he hadn't felt in ages, the warmth of rescue, of a second chance. If he had the strength, Jonah would have hugged the horse's neck and whispered his thanks. Instead, he could only stare, letting silent gratitude seep from his eyes. The stranger lifted Jonah with surprising gentleness. Though each movement sent pains ripping through Jonah's frail body, he endured it. The man carried him toward a beat-up truck that sat in the distance, engine idling. The horse trailed behind, ears flicking, as though it wasn't willing to abandon the boy it had found. At the truck's open door, Jonah noticed a small trailer attached in the back, obviously meant for the horse. The man slid Jonah onto the passenger seat. Everything spun for a moment, the world's edges blurred with pain and exhaustion. Yet Jonah clung to consciousness, desperate to understand what was happening. "Name's Micah," the man said, leaning over Jonah to secure him with the seatbelt. "Don't try to talk. We'll get you to a doctor soon enough." Micah's stern voice held a note of urgency, but also kindness. In the swirl of Jonah's feverish mind, that kindness was more precious than all the water in the world. He tried to form words. The thank. "You do soon," but his tongue felt thick, and he wasn't sure if he managed any sound at all. Micah shut the passenger door, then walked around to guide the horse into the trailer. Jonah blinked slowly, scanning the interior of the truck. A battered duffel bag on the floor, a cowboy hat on the dash, the faint scent of hay and leather. He heard the horse's muffled hooves as Micah coaxed it inside. Once man and horse were settled, the truck began its slow, jolting journey. Jonah's head lolled against the seat. A wave of dizziness tried to pull him back into unconsciousness, but before he lost his grip on awareness, he saw the shape of the horse through a small side mirror, its dark eyes, full of quiet resolve, fixed on the road ahead. The last coherent thought Jonah clung to was that everything he had believed about being unwanted was not entirely true. Yes, his stepfather had abandoned him, but the universe, in its strange and wondrous way, had sent him a guardian, an unlikely savior on four hooves. The boy who had resigned himself to dying alone in the desert now felt a faint but persistent stirring of hope. As he sank into uneasy sleep, lulled by the truck's rumbling engine, Jonah sensed the horizon of his life shifting. This was just the beginning of a story he never dreamed he'd be a part of. A story of betrayal and rescue, of heartbreak and healing, and above all, of a horse that refused to let him go. Jonah roused from his feverish sleep to the soft rumble of tires on a dirt road. His head throbbed, and every muscle felt as though it had been stretched beyond its limit. Blinking against the morning light that streamed through the dusty windshield, he realized he was still in Micah's truck. The events of the previous day flickered through his mind in jumbled fragments, the scorching desert, the paralyzing weakness, and above all, the horse that had saved him. He wanted to speak, to ask where they were going, but his throat was too raw for more than a rasping breath. Through half-lidded eyes, Jonah glimpsed Micah's grim, focused expression. The older man seemed intent on reaching his destination as fast as possible, occasionally glancing at the rearview mirror where the horse trailer swayed with each bump. Gradually, Jonah pieced together small details about his rescuer. An old felt hat lay on the dashboard, near a faded photograph that depicted a smiling woman and a young girl, both with wide-brimmed hats of their own. The truck's interior smelled of sweat, leather, and a faint trace of antiseptic, as though it had once been used to transport injured animals. Whenever they hit a rough patch of ground, Micah would mutter curses under his breath, hands tightening around the steering wheel. Jonah wanted to thank him, but all he managed was a weak croak that Micah did not seem to hear. In the haze of exhaustion, Jonah let his head loll against the seat again, drifting between hazy consciousness and a swirl of indistinct memories. It felt like hours had passed when the truck finally slowed. Jonah forced himself to stay awake, pushing past the waves of pain rolling through his body. The vehicle turned onto a narrower path, lined with scrub and wiry desert plants. Then, as they crested a small rise, Jonah spotted a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by a low fence. A battered sign overhead read, "Desert Bell Ranch." The sight of it kindled a flicker of hope in Jonah's chest. He was no longer adrift in the wilderness. Perhaps here he could find not only the medical help he needed, but also the faint promise of a fresh start. He glanced toward the mirror, wondering if the horse felt the same relief he did. Micah parked near a weather-beaten stable, its faded red paint clinging to boards warped by sun and wind. Before Jonah could gather enough strength to unbuckle himself, the door on his side swung open. Micah's hand reached in to steady him. "I'll get you inside," the man said, voice laced with the same gruff gentleness Jonah had heard back in the desert. With surprising care, Micah helped Jonah stand, supporting most of his weight. They inched across the yard, passing corrals that held a few scrawny goats and a pair of nervous-looking donkeys. A tall windmill creaked in the background, underscoring the otherwise silent ranch. Jonah's vision blurred from the effort of walking, and he was aware of a pounding in his ears. A door opened, releasing a gust of cooler air that smelled faintly of bread and disinfectant. Micah guided Jonah onto a couch in what appeared to be a small office or living area. Old trophies glinted on a nearby shelf, some shaped like horses, others for rodeo contests. Folders and papers were scattered across a large wooden desk, but Jonah had no time to read their labels. His body was rebelling, and he could barely keep his eyes open as Micah disappeared into another room. A moment later, a woman with dark braided hair and a stern face entered. She knelt beside Jonah, pressing a cool palm to his forehead. "The boy's burning up," she murmured, turning to Micah. "We'll need fluids, and I'll do what I can for the fever." Jonah understood little of what she said next. She mentioned something about infection, about dehydration, and about how it was a miracle he had survived the night at all. Then, with a swift efficiency, she began tending to him, cleaning the sand and grime from his arms and applying a damp cloth to his face. Her name, he discovered later, was Celia, and although she didn't smile, her quiet determination felt like a lifeline. Time took on a sluggish pace in that office. The world shrank to the dimensions of the couch where Jonah lay, half conscious, vaguely aware of the needle prick in his arm as Celia administered fluid through an IV line. Now and then, Micah would speak in low tones, explaining what had happened. Jonah caught fragments. "Found him in the desert. Horse led me straight there. Stepdad's truck tracks." Celia would grunt in acknowledgement, or mutter curses about men who would leave a kid to die. Every so often, Jonah would drift into a shallow sleep, lulled by the hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Eventually, Jonah awoke to a soft blanket tucked around him. The room was quiet, lit by the dying glow of late afternoon. He felt more lucid, though still weak as a newborn calf. The thirst in his throat was bearable now, thanks to Celia's ministrations. Carefully, he turned his head, his gaze landing on Micah, who sat at the desk, flipping through an old ledger. "You awake?" the man asked, noticing Jonah's movement. Jonah nodded. He tried to speak, but his voice came out gravelly and faint. "Thank you," he managed. Micah set down the ledger and approached the couch, his expression warm beneath the tough exterior. "You're welcome," Micah replied, pulling a metal folding chair closer. "Couldn't just leave you out there, especially after that horse showed me where to find you." At that, Jonah's eyes lit with concern. He wanted to know where the horse was, but the words tangled in his throat. Thankfully, Micah understood. "He's in the stable," the man said. "Had a vet come by and check him out. A few scars, some malnutrition, but he'll be fine." "Seems attached to you, oddly enough." Jonah's heart twisted with a rush of gratitude and something else, an ache for the loyal creature that had saved his life. He remembered the way the horse had stood vigil in the desert, pressing its muzzle to Jonah's cheek as though to offer comfort. Before Jonah could dwell on the thought, Celia returned, carrying a mug of broth. She handed it to Jonah and motioned for him to drink slowly. The warmth of it soothed his parched throat. Once he had sipped a few mouthfuls, Celia folded her arms. "Your fever's down," she observed. "You might be strong enough to move around soon, but not tonight. Rest is what you need." Jonah nodded, too drained to argue. He forced out a question. "Can I see him?" Celia frowned, and Micah exchanged a glance with her. "Maybe tomorrow," Celia said. "You can't be pushing yourself yet." Jonah closed his eyes, yielding to her authority. He sensed that protesting would do no good. Besides, exhaustion was already tugging him back into a doze. Through his half-closed lids, he watched Micah and Celia speak in hushed tones, though he couldn't make out their words. He woke again to a dimly lit room, the sky outside a tapestry of stars. Somewhere near the door, Micah and Celia were discussing him. "Who doesn't want to talk about his stepfather?" Celia was saying. "Let the boy tell it when he's ready," Micah responded. "Pressing him won't help." Jonah felt a pang at the mention of the man who had cast him off like unwanted baggage. In that painful instant, memories flared. Arguments in a grimy kitchen, hateful words about medical bills when Jonah fell sick, the biting sting of being told he was nothing but a burden. There had been no final goodbye, just the roar of the engine and the swirl of desert dust as the truck sped away. When morning came, Jonah managed to sit upright on the couch without feeling like the room was spinning. Celia checked his temperature and nodded in satisfaction. "Your fever's nearly gone. We can try walking a bit." Although Jonah's limbs trembled, he forced himself to stand, leaning heavily on Celia. They ventured into the yard, where early sun rays cast long shadows across the ranch. Jonah's stomach clenched with anxiety and anticipation. He scanned the area, searching for any sign of the horse. The stable door was slightly ajar, and a soft huff sounded from within. Celia guided him inside. Dust motes floated in the gentle light, and the smell of hay wrapped around Jonah like a comforting blanket. A low wicker emerged from the far stall, where the same dark, scarred horse stood. His ears pricked up at the sight of Jonah, and an odd spark passed between them. Jonah's eyes filled with tears he was too weak to hold back. "Hey," he whispered, moving closer, one slow step at a time. The horse responded by stepping forward, muzzle reaching out tentatively. Jonah lifted a shaky hand and let the horse sniff his fingers before running his palm gently over the animal's nose. "Looks like he remembers you," Celia said quietly from behind. Indeed. There was no fear or distrust in the horse's stance, only a calm acceptance. Jonah was reminded of that moment in the desert when he'd felt the horse's breath against his cheek. Now, in the safety of the stable, his heart overflowed with gratitude. "Can I?" Jonah began, turning to Celia for permission. She nodded, and Jonah reached into the bucket of feed set out for the horse, scooping up a handful of grain. Offering it on his open palm, he watched as the horse nibbled gently. An emotional lump rose in Jonah's throat. It felt surreal to stand there, alive and relatively safe, in the presence of this creature that had saved him from certain death. Micah appeared at the stable door, arms crossed over his chest. He said nothing for a moment, simply observing the boy and the horse. Then, clearing his throat, he spoke. "He's yours, you know," Micah said. Jonah turned as confused. "What do you mean?" Micah shrugged. "I can see there's a bond between you two. If you want, he can stay here on the ranch while you recover. We'll take care of him together." Jonah's first impulse was to protest, claiming he had no right to own anything. But a deep yearning flared within him. He felt as if he and this horse had forged an unbreakable link in the desert. Yet old fears dragged at him. He had always been told he was worthless, so how could he assume responsibility for such a noble creature? Lost in uncertainty, Jonah stroked the horse's neck, feeling the rough texture of old scars beneath his fingertips. "He saved me," Jonah murmured. "So I guess I owe him at least that much." Micah offered a rare smile. "Trust me, boy, animals don't think of debts the way we do, but I can tell he trusts you. That's enough reason to let you make the decisions for him." Celia, finishing her inspection of another stall, chimed in. "If you stay, you can help with chores and learn some ranch work once you're stronger. We're short-staffed here, and an extra set of hands, even a young set, would be welcome." Jonah's cheeks burned at the invitation, though he suspected it was partly pity. Still, he wouldn't mind repaying their kindness. "Thank you," he said simply, sincerity shining in his eyes. Celia nodded, and Micah gave the horse a gentle pat on its flank. "You two rest up. We've got all the time in the world to figure things out." Over the next few days, Jonah's strength returned by degrees. He could walk without support, eat solid food, and even manage light tasks like brushing the horse's coat or refilling water troughs. Each moment spent with the horse was a step closer to healing, both physically and emotionally. He had not yet shared details about his life before the desert, and Micah and Celia did not pry, though they offered quiet reassurance that he was safe now. At night, Jonah sometimes woke in a cold sweat, haunted by nightmares of the desert sun and his stepfather's grim sneer. But the presence of the horse, dozing in the stable just yards away, seemed to anchor him against those terrors. Whenever the topic of naming the horse arose, Jonah fell silent, unsure if it was right for him to give the animal a name. Eventually, one morning as he brushed the horse's mane, he whispered a name that had come to him in a dream: Rumi. It sounded melodic, carrying hints of both mystery and resilience. The horse flicked his ears as though accepting, and Jonah felt his chest warm with a fragile sense of belonging. Here, amid the ranch's dusty paddocks and silent dawns, he had found not just survival, but a tenuous hope for the future. Ever since Jonah had decided to name the horse Rumi, a quiet determination had begun to bloom in his heart. Each morning, he woke to the distant sounds of goats bleating and the windmill's rusty groan, reminding him that life on the ranch was grounded in daily rhythms: sunrise chores, midday breaks in the shade, and evenings spent winding down in the cool desert air. He would slip from the makeshift bed in the office, rub the sleep from his eyes, and shuffle to the stable. At first, his legs threatened to give out after a few steps, still weakened by his ordeal, but day by day he gained strength, leaning less on the improvised cane Celia had fashioned for him and more on his own resolve. Rumi always greeted him with a soft nicker that hinted at patience and expectation. Standing beside the stall, Jonah would run his fingers through Rumi's mane, taking note of every tangle and burr, determined to brush away any sign of neglect. He still found it difficult to speak in more than a low whisper, but his heart felt lighter each time he reached the stable and saw Rumi waiting. In these early days, Micah and Celia gave Jonah space to learn the ranch's routine on his own terms. Micah would nod toward a particular chore, filling water troughs or tossing bales of hay, and Jonah would do what he could, sometimes struggling to lift even half a bale without losing balance. He'd grit his teeth and push forward, fueled by a sense of gratitude for the safe haven they'd offered him. Celia, for all her brisk manner, was surprisingly adept at reading Jonah's limits. One afternoon, when Jonah insisted he could handle a heavier task, she caught him just as he stumbled, hooking an arm around his waist to steady him. "That fever may be gone," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "but your body still needs time. Don't push yourself into a relapse." Though Jonah felt a stab of embarrassment, the concern in her eyes soothed his pride. He managed a small nod, silently thankful for her watchful care. In the nights that followed, Jonah's restless dreams continued. He would awaken in a cold sweat, the memory of his stepfather's hardened face flooding his mind, the final words they had exchanged, the brutal moment when the truck door slammed, echoed again and again. Yet there was something reassuring about knowing that just a short walk away, Rumi was likely dozing or pacing in the moonlit stable. Jonah found himself sneaking out occasionally, barefoot on the dusty path, to place a hand on the horse's flank and breathe in the comforting smell of hay. Sometimes Rumi would blink slowly, as though half asleep, but still accept Jonah's presence without a trace of alarm. These quiet encounters became a nightly ritual, a way of grounding himself against the nightmares that tried to reclaim him. Over breakfast one morning, Micah gently broached the subject of Jonah's past. The man had laid out eggs and fried potatoes on a chipped plate, and Jonah's mouth watered at the sight of warm food. Tentatively, as Jonah ate, Micah said, "You don't have to tell me anything, son, but if there's someone who might be worried about you, we can try to contact them." Jonah's stomach clenched around the food. He set down his fork and stared at the table. Memories of his mother surfaced, along with the knowledge that she was gone, leaving him at the mercy of a man who had seen no worth in him at all. "There's no one," Jonah finally whispered, voice trembling with old pain. Celia, seated nearby, pretended to busy herself with a stack of papers, but Jonah sensed she was listening closely. Micah nodded slowly, not pressing further. Something in his posture suggested he understood abandonment in ways he didn't articulate. Jonah felt a flicker of relief that the conversation halted there. Instead, Micah diverted the topic to a different project, hinting that Jonah might want to help them train Rumi for light riding. The idea startled the boy. He recalled Rumi's scars and how the horse sometimes flinched at sudden noises, as if remembering prior mistreatment. Jonah feared riding would be too great a demand, yet Micah's tone held a gentle confidence. "No rush," the older man said, "but he's got the spirit of a horse that wants to carry a friend, not just stand in a stall." Celia agreed, pointing out that Rumi's physical health had improved drastically in just a short time. They had begun supplementing the horse's diet with nutrient-rich feed, and Jonah had taken care to treat any wounds or irritations he found during grooming. Though Rumi's ribs still showed faintly, his coat had grown glossier, and his eyes were bright with curiosity. "You have a bond," Celia added. "If anyone can get him comfortable under a saddle, it's you." Jonah felt a flutter of excitement mixed with trepidation. Could he truly guide Rumi through that sort of trust? He decided to start small. Each day after his chores, Jonah would lead Rumi by a soft rope around the corral, speaking low words of reassurance whenever the horse seemed skittish. The first time he draped a blanket across Rumi's back, the animal stiffened, ears twitching in alarm. Jonah eased it off immediately, his heart pounding with concern that he might frighten Rumi into a panic. "It's okay," Jonah whispered, rubbing small circles behind Rumi's ears in the way he'd learned relax the horse most. Gradually, Rumi calmed, though his breathing remained quick and shallow. Over the following days, Jonah tried again, each time moving slower and letting Rumi sniff the blanket before draping it. Little by little, the horse stood his ground without recoiling. When Jonah finally managed to fasten a simple girth strap beneath the horse's belly, it felt like a momentous victory. He glanced at the stable door and found Micah leaning against the frame, arms folded in quiet approval. "You two are doing fine," the older man said. Jonah's lips curved in a fleeting smile. One afternoon, a rusty pickup rattled into the ranch yard, dust swirling around the tires. A heavy-set woman stepped out, wearing a straw hat and carrying a medical bag. Jonah recognized her as Dr. Evelyn, the traveling veterinarian who sometimes came by to check on animals in the more remote corners of the desert region. She gave Rumi a thorough examination, from teeth to hooves, murmuring observations in an even, calm voice. "He's healing well," she said, patting Rumi's flank. "But there's trauma that won't vanish overnight." Then she cast Jonah a meaningful look, her gaze kind. "Horses remember who hurts them and who doesn't. You keep on as you have, and he'll learn to trust the world again." Jonah nodded, swallowing back a sudden surge of emotion. He wondered if she was really talking about Rumi, or if her words also applied to him. The next weeks saw Jonah and Rumi venturing out into a small practice ring. Jonah would hold the lead rope while guiding Rumi around gentle circles, eventually introducing a light saddle. Every step was cautious, each new piece of equipment tested for any sign of panic. Jonah spent hours just standing beside Rumi, letting the horse sense that none of this was meant to harm him. Sometimes Rumi would jerk his head or flare his nostrils at the squeak of leather straps, recalling old fears. But Jonah never forced the process, always ready to step back and reassure. Micah occasionally offered pointers, reminding Jonah to keep his voice steady and avoid sudden gestures. Celia watched from a distance, her approval measured but genuine. For Jonah, each day of progress felt like another link in the invisible chain that bound him to Rumi. They were both learning what it meant to face vulnerability together, forging trust that neither had experienced in a long time. Amid these tentative steps toward training, Jonah found himself opening up to Celia and Micah in small ways. He never gave a complete account of his stepfather's cruelties. He wasn't sure he could bring himself to relive the darkest memories. But he mentioned the lonely nights after his mother's funeral, the resentment that had simmered in the house, and the final argument that led to being driven into the desert under false pretenses. His voice shook when he admitted that he truly believed he would die alone out there. Hearing his own words, Jonah realized how immense his trauma was. But as he spoke, Celia placed a steady hand on his shoulder, and Micah's eyes shone with a sympathy that was neither pity nor judgment. Somehow, that combination of understanding and gentle encouragement helped him release a fraction of the burden he'd carried. One evening, as a warm wind blew across the ranch yard, Jonah stood at the fence with Rumi, watching the last traces of sunlight fade behind distant mesas. The sky turned brilliant shades of orange and pink, and Jonah let his mind wander. He thought about how close he'd come to losing everything: his life, his will, his trust in others. The stepfather who had cast him off might still be out there, living without a second thought for what he'd done. Yet Jonah felt no urge to chase him down or seek revenge. Instead, he realized he wanted to focus on the future. Standing beside this horse, he understood that healing was possible, even in a place as harsh as the desert. The land was unyielding, but it was also honest. You gave what you could, and if you persevered, it might give something back. Rumi nudged Jonah's arm gently, and he smiled, stroking the horse's neck. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he meant it for the horse, for Micah and Celia, or for whatever unseen force had guided Rumi to him. As the desert nights continued to blanket the ranch in a hush of stars, Jonah found himself torn between relief at his new life and the occasional ache of old fears. Summer's heat showed no mercy, yet the gentle hush of the breeze past the paddocks provided solace. Most evenings, after finishing chores, Jonah would sit with Rumi in the corral, coaxing the horse to accept small, unfamiliar sounds. He jingled pockets of loose metal washers or gently rattled a bucket, helping Rumi adapt. Sometimes Celia wandered by, quietly observing. Jonah often felt her unspoken encouragement, even when they exchanged few words. Gradually, he sensed that the ranch was becoming more than a temporary shelter. It was becoming a place where, day by day, he learned to let go of the desert's haunting memory. Yet each time he drifted off to sleep, he prayed that no one would come looking for him from the life he'd left behind. Early one morning, Jonah stepped outside to find Micah piling scrap lumber near a shed that looked like it was half collapsed. Spotting Jonah, Micah set down a plank and motioned him over. "Reckon we could use another hand building a new enclosure for the goats," he said. Though Jonah still felt twinges of fatigue, the idea of being useful stirred him to action. Together, they measured lengths of wood and hammered nails, the steady clink of metal on metal blending with the goats' bleating from across the yard. Sweat dripped down Jonah's forehead, but the work felt oddly rewarding. Here, his effort mattered. By midday, their progress was visible, the rough outline of a sturdy pen that promised to keep the animals safe. Micah grinned, passing Jonah a canteen of water as they took a break in the shade. "Keep this up, and we might just make a rancher out of you yet." During lunch, Celia prepared sandwiches with thick slices of ham, setting them on a small wooden table by the stable. Jonah ate quietly, glancing across the yard where Rumi grazed in a patch of pale grass. The horse's posture had changed since arriving here. He no longer jerked his head at every rustle in the wind. While he still startled at sharp noises, Jonah marveled at how quickly Rumi regained his composure now. It felt like a mirror to Jonah's own progress. He, too, had begun to sleep without waking in terror. He, too, found solace in the daily tasks that grounded him. Celia caught Jonah's wandering gaze and offered a faint smile. "He's coming along nicely," she said. "You both are." Jonah lowered his eyes, a warmth spreading through his chest. Though her words were few, they carried all the encouragement he needed. That evening, the three of them settled around a modest dinner table, the overhead bulb flickering. Micah pulled out a battered radio, tuning into a local station that played scratchy country tunes interspersed with weather updates. Celia talked about the ranch's finances, exhaling wearily at the mention of overdue supplies. Jonah listened quietly, marveling at how, despite the ranch's struggles, Micah and Celia carried on with unwavering grit. They never complained about the hardships. If anything, it fueled their determination. After dinner, Jonah excused himself and made his way to the stable where Rumi awaited. The horse gave a low nicker when Jonah approached. Leaning on the stall door, Jonah quietly recited fragments of stories his mother once told him about strong-hearted horses roaming the frontier. Each memory rekindled something hopeful in him, something he hoped Rumi sensed too. One afternoon, a distant rumble approached, and soon a battered motorcycle rolled onto the ranch. Its rider, wearing a bright bandana around his neck, cut the engine near the gate. Jonah tensed, half expecting trouble. However, Micah strode out to greet the newcomer with an easy wave. "That's Carlos," he explained over his shoulder to Jonah. "Used to help us with cattle runs before the drought." Carlos's face split into a grin as he and Micah embraced with friendly backslaps. They talked in low voices, Carlos gesturing animatedly. Jonah couldn't help but notice the lines of worry on Micah's brow. Whatever was going on, it seemed serious. When Carlos left an hour later, Micah's features were set in grim resolve. Celia pressed for details, but Micah merely shrugged. "We might have to move our herd sooner than expected," he said. "The grazing's almost gone." Jonah wondered how this might affect the new life he'd found here, but dared not ask. As the days stretched into weeks, Jonah's bond with Rumi grew stronger. He began introducing the horse to a simple bridle, placing the bit gently between Rumi's teeth. The first time, Rumi tossed his head and backed away, eyes wide with remembered panic. Jonah patiently removed the bridle, stroking Rumi's mane, waiting a full day before trying again. Their second attempt went smoother, and by the third, Rumi allowed the bridle without flinching. Encouraged, Jonah asked Micah for advice on mounting. The older man showed him how to approach from the side, how to ease into the saddle without startling the horse. One evening, after many cautious half-mounts, Jonah finally settled onto Rumi's back. His heart pounded in his chest, but the horse stood still, ears flicking. Jonah felt as though he'd climbed a mountain he once thought impossible to summit. They took their first slow circles around the corral, Jonah's hands shaking on the reins. Rumi's muscles tensed beneath the saddle, but after a few steps, the horse's movements smoothed, guided by Jonah's gentle commands. Micah, watching from the fence, offered calm words. "Don't grip too tight with your knees. Give him room to breathe." Celia observed from a distance, arms folded in approval. When Jonah dismounted, a wave of exhilaration washed over him. Rumi snorted, flicking his tail as though to say he, too, recognized this accomplishment. Jonah patted the horse's neck, unable to hide the grin that stretched across his face. That night, he slept dreamlessly, exhausted but proud of the trust they were building. Word of Jonah's recovery and Rumi's progress began to spread quietly among neighbors, most of whom had visited the ranch at least once. A kindly older couple stopped by to deliver fresh vegetables from their garden, insisting that Jonah accept a jar of pickled carrots for his horse. Jonah found himself blushing at the attention. He was unaccustomed to kindness from strangers, and each gesture felt almost surreal. In the stable, he'd show Rumi the gifts, laughing when the horse tried to nibble at the basket's edge. Sometimes, while they worked on ground exercises, Jonah would chat softly, telling Rumi about dreams he never dared articulate before. He confessed a half-formed desire to learn more about veterinary care, or perhaps become a trainer someday. The horse, of course, offered no human reply, but Jonah believed that in its own quiet way, Rumi was listening. Meanwhile, Micah wrestled with the ranch's challenges. The wells threatened to run dry, and the cost of hauling water from town kept climbing. The goats grazed sparse patches, scrounging for anything green. Celia proposed selling a portion of their livestock before the situation worsened, but Micah hesitated, reluctant to concede defeat. One blistering afternoon, Jonah found him standing near a wind-eroded fence post, gazing over the shriveled pasture. "Wish the rains would come," Micah murmured. Then, turning to Jonah, he asked, "Ever think about what you'll do when you're stronger, once you've fully recovered?" Jonah hesitated, remembering how fragile his place in the world felt. Finally, he shook his head. "I haven't decided," he said softly. "But I'd like to stay if you'll have me." Micah nodded, the lines of worry in his face softening. "We'll figure something out, kid. One way or another." That same evening, Jonah guided Rumi out beyond the corral, stepping carefully into the open desert. The horizon glowed with the last of the sunlight, and for a moment he felt the vastness of his second chance. Rumi moved with cautious grace, responding to each shift of Jonah's weight. When they reached a gentle rise, Jonah paused to admire the ranch below, the old barn, the windmill, and Micah's battered truck. A surge of gratitude welled in him, mixed with the ghost of lingering fear. Yet as Rumi snorted softly, Jonah inhaled the horse's warmth and realized that, for now, hope outweighed every dark memory. He urged the horse forward more. In the deepening twilight, Jonah turned Rumi back toward home, heart brimming with a cautious optimism. Each hoofbeat echoed an unspoken promise that in this place, amid the dusty corrals and the unwavering care of new friends, he could forge a life defined not by abandonment, but by resilience. It was a promise he vowed never again to let slip away. The following week brought an unexpected shift in routine. After days of hot, stagnant air, gusts of wind blew through the ranch, swirling dust devils across the sparse fields. The sky glimmered with promise, a dome of pale blue as if rain might finally grace the cracked earth. Jonah began his morning as usual, waking before sunrise to feed Rumi. He grabbed a handful of sweet-smelling hay, tossing it over the stall door while murmuring a soft greeting to the horse. Rumi responded by bobbing his head and nudging Jonah's shoulder gently, as if already comfortable in this daily dance of mutual recognition. Despite the sweltering heat that would soon descend, the early hour felt calm, carrying the faintest chill that lingered from the night. Jonah breathed it in, grateful for another day of steady progress. Micah appeared soon after, calling Jonah over to the goat pen they had recently reinforced. There, he pointed out a newly arrived bundle of trouble, a heavily pregnant goat that paced nervously, bleating with every step. "She's near her time," Micah explained, sliding the lock on the pen gate and entering with cautious steps. The goat eyed him warily but didn't back away. Jonah followed, crouching near the edge of the fence to observe. "We need to keep an eye on her," Micah continued, "and if she goes into labor soon, we'll have to help." It's her first kidding. Jonah's heart thumped with both excitement and concern. He knew little about the delicate matter of livestock births, but he sensed Micah's confidence, and that helped soothe his own uncertainty. In a world that had once made Jonah feel helpless, each challenge here seemed like a chance to learn, both about animals and about himself. Celia joined them a short while later, bearing a tin coffee pot and a worried frown. "Any sign of trouble yet?" she asked, her gaze flicking to the goat. Micah shook his head. "Not yet, but it could happen any time. Let's keep her in the separate enclosure, away from the others." Jonah stood, dusting off his jeans. "I can watch her if you need," he offered quietly, determined to lighten their workload. Celia gave him an approving nod. "It'd help," she said. "I've got to make a supply run in town. You two keep me updated." With that, she departed, leaving Jonah and Micah to handle whatever the day might bring. Jonah swallowed a surge of nerves, steeling himself for the possibility of witnessing birth and all its unpredictable twists. As the sun climbed, Jonah did his best to juggle responsibilities. Between checking on the goat and fetching water for the other animals, he slipped into the stable to see Rumi. He had been working on a slow, careful approach to riding, one that prioritized Rumi's comfort above all else. Each session, Jonah would mount the horse, take a few steps, and then dismount, offering gentle praise and a favorite treat, a sliced apple or a bit of carrot. Rumi seemed to catch on quickly, developing a mild impatience when Jonah paused too long before the next exercise. This morning, though, Jonah felt a restlessness that tugged at him, as if the changing winds and the goat's impending birth signaled a turning point for everyone on the ranch. By midday, the temperature soared. Waves of heat danced over the baked earth, and the goat's bleating grew louder. Worried, Jonah inspected her pen and noted that she paced erratically, her sides bulging in sharp relief. Micah, emerging from the barn with a coil of rope slung over one shoulder, joined Jonah at the fence. "She's getting close," he muttered. "Best we move her to the shade of the lean-to." Together, they coaxed the skittish animal under a weathered shelter. Micah then retrieved a box of clean towels and a small kit of veterinary supplies. Jonah felt anxiety bubble in his stomach. Despite his eagerness to help, he'd never been this close to the raw reality of birth. Sure enough, within the hour, the goat sank to her knees, her eyes wide and panicked. Her cries escalated into sharp, urgent bleats. Jonah swallowed hard, remembering Celia's advice to stay calm. Following Micah's lead, he knelt at the goat's flank, murmuring gentle words that he hoped sounded reassuring. Micah, his sleeves rolled up, checked the goat for signs of difficulty, occasionally instructing Jonah to adjust her position. Time seemed to slow, measured by the goat's labored breathing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first kid arrived, a fragile, slippery form that Micah carefully swaddled in a towel. Jonah's throat constricted at the sight of new life, so tiny and vulnerable. He helped wipe the kid's muzzle as Micah guided it toward the mother. The goat emitted a trembling moan, but instinct soon took over as she began licking her newborn clean. Minutes later, a second kid followed. Jonah's breath caught in his chest at the unexpected arrival. Twins. He repeated the same process, wiping and positioning, heart pounding with a mixture of exhilaration and responsibility. When both kids were safely at their mother's side, Jonah sank onto a bale of straw, arms limp with relief. Micah surveyed the scene, a rare smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You did good, kid," he said softly, and Jonah knew he wasn't just talking about the goats. While Jonah tended to the newborns, Micah fetched water to wash away the afterbirth and the sticky residue of delivery. The ranch felt momentarily suspended in a hush of awe, as though nature itself was celebrating the miracle of life. Once everything was cleaned, Jonah stood back to watch the mother goat nuzzle her kids with surprising gentleness. Exhaustion weighed on him, but a thread of pride sparked in his chest, pride in being part of a world that, for all its hardships, still allowed room for small wonders. Celia returned later to find Jonah leaning against the pen, arms folded, gazing at the goat family with a quietly content expression. She hurried over, eyebrows raised. "Twins!" she exclaimed, peering inside. Micah, wiping sweat from his brow, confirmed it. "Both healthy. Boy here did half the work." At that, Celia turned to Jonah, a hint of admiration lighting her features. "I'm impressed," she said simply. Jonah ducked his head, cheeks warming. It wasn't often that he felt genuinely useful, let alone praised, but in this ranch life, it seemed he was carving out a place. That night, they shared a simple meal in the house, discussing the goat's future and how best to stretch the ranch's limited resources. Celia noted that the newborns would require special attention, particularly in a drought. Jonah volunteered to wake early for feedings and to check on water levels, mindful that each small task gave him a deeper sense of belonging. When dinner wrapped, he lingered at the table, half expecting Micah or Celia to bring up the subject of his stepfather or the risk of that man returning, but neither did, as though they sensed Jonah needed the space to define his own course. Sleep eluded him, so Jonah slipped out to walk beneath the moonlight. The ranch was still silvered under the night sky. As he passed the stable, he heard a gentle whicker. Rumi, alert even at this late hour. Jonah entered quietly, stroking the horse's flank and noticing how the soft glow made Rumi's coat gleam like polished onyx. He thought back to that awful day in the desert, remembering how a shivering fever and parched lips had nearly stolen his life. It was Rumi who had refused to leave him, who had somehow guided Micah to that lifeless stretch of sand. Jonah exhaled, feeling a knot of gratitude and vulnerability tighten in his chest. He bent closer, pressing his forehead lightly against Rumi's neck. "We saw life begin today," Jonah whispered, voice trembling with unspoken emotion, "and it reminded me that I can start over too." Rumi's ears pricked at his tone, and the horse nudged Jonah's shoulder as if echoing that sentiment. Jonah allowed himself a single tear, a private acknowledgement of how precarious yet precious second chances truly were. The next day, Jonah awoke to find Celia and Micah already outside, studying the horizon. The radiant sunrise revealed a mass of dark clouds gathering far off over the mountains, a rare sight in this drought-stricken land. As Jonah joined them, Micah inhaled deeply. "Looks like we might get rain," he said, sounding both hopeful and wary. Celia, shading her eyes with one hand, nodded. "If the wind carries it our way, it could help. If not..." She didn't finish her sentence, but the implication was clear. The ranch's survival hinged on such uncontrollable elements, and time was running short. Jonah offered to go for a ride on Rumi, scouting the edges of the property to see if any vegetation might spring back with just a bit of moisture. Celia hesitated, glancing at Micah. They had yet to let Jonah roam the ranch's far boundaries alone. Concern shadowed her face, but Micah eventually relented. "All right," he said quietly, turning to Jonah, "but stay within sight of the ridge and come back if the weather turns. We can't risk you getting caught in a flash flood." Jonah agreed, touched by their trust. He saddled Rumi, carefully checking every strap, ensuring the horse was comfortable. Then, with a gentle nudge of his heels, he guided Rumi toward the far fence line. The air felt charged, each breeze tinged with something electric. Rumi seemed to sense it, tossing his head and snorting as they moved across the parched earth. Jonah kept his grip relaxed, mindful of not transferring any of his own excitement to the horse. Occasionally, a lizard darted across their path, and Rumi flicked an ear but didn't spook. Jonah recognized that this was progress. Just weeks earlier, the slightest sudden movement would have caused Rumi to wheel in alarm. They rode in companionable silence, the only sounds being the soft creak of leather and the muted thud of hooves on dusty ground. When they reached a gentle rise, Jonah halted Rumi and let his gaze sweep the land. The brush that had once been green was now brittle, snapping like twigs at the lightest touch. He remembered the day's miracle of goat births and how fragile new life could be under such harsh conditions. For a moment, he prayed silently that the clouds gathering in the distance might carry enough rain to revive these fields. He patted Rumi's neck. "Let's head back," he said softly. "They'll be waiting." Back at the ranch, the sky had darkened further, thick clouds rolling in from the west. Celia had her face turned upward as the first drops of rain began to fall, heavy, round droplets that left dark splotches in the dusty yard. Jonah dismounted, heart pounding with cautious elation. Micah strode forward, arms lifted skyward, as if in gratitude. Within minutes, those droplets became a steady downpour, hammering the tin roof of the stable and kicking up plumes of dust that smelled sweetly of damp earth. Rumi sidestepped and snorted at the sudden onslaught, but Jonah held his reins, murmuring encouragement until the horse settled. Laughter bubbled up from Jonah's chest as the warm rain soaked through his clothes. Celia, wet strands of hair sticking to her cheeks, passed around a grin that felt as joyful as any celebration. They busied themselves quickly, moving horses and goats under shelter and laying out containers to catch every precious drop of water. Thunder rumbled in the distance, but the storm's heart seemed to hover directly above the ranch, refusing to move on. In a matter of minutes, rivulets formed in the yard, carving tiny paths through the packed soil. Jonah helped Micah direct the flow toward the thirsty troughs. The dryness of the ranch gulped in the moisture, and Jonah marveled at how the landscape could shift so drastically in such a short span of time. When the rain finally eased to a gentle drizzle, a hush fell over the ranch. The trio gathered under the stable's overhang, each damp but glowing with relief. Rumi stood close by, shaking droplets from his coat. For the first time in weeks, Jonah felt an undercurrent of genuine optimism, like the desert itself had chosen to grant them a reprieve. Celia exhaled, stepping out from under the shelter to scan the puddles glistening in the yard. Micah gave Jonah a nudge with his elbow. "Good day's work," he said softly, referring not just to the birth of twin goats or the scouting trip, but to the collective effort it took to keep hope alive out here. Jonah nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He could almost feel the parched soil breathing again, renewed by the cloudburst. And in that moment, he believed the ranch's fate might yet turn around. The ranch smelled new after the precious rain, with damp earth exhaling a scent of renewal that drifted through the corrals. Jonah rose early, his spirits lifted by the memory of thunder rolling overhead and water cascading from the roof. Now the sun gleamed on puddles that dotted the yard, and he stepped around them, making his way to check on the goat enclosure. The twin kids had snuggled beside their mother for the night, and at Jonah's approach, they bounded forward with bright, wobbly legs. He laughed, bending to scratch one kid's soft ear. Even the mother goat seemed to have relaxed, her bleating subdued by the comforting presence of fresh water and a stable shelter. Within him, Jonah felt a similar sense of calm. The residue of past fears faded into the background as the ranch pulsed with cautious optimism. Micah was already at work, inspecting the fence lines for loose boards that the rain might have warped. He spotted Jonah near the goat pen and waved him over, pointing toward a section of fence leaning at an awkward angle. "Storm did us a favor with the water," Micah said, "but we'll need to shore this up or risk having animals wander." Grabbing a hammer and a box of nails, Jonah joined in, feeling the pleasant ache in his muscles from the previous day's labor. In that moment, he realized that the ranch's hardships, lack of water, old structures, meager finances, had become shared burdens he wanted to shoulder. Not long ago, he would have run from conflict or drifted in fear. Now, he pounded nails into wood and felt an odd satisfaction in knowing that something he fixed would stand against the desert wind. As mid-morning arrived, Celia emerged from the house with a clipboard of notes. She and Micah walked the property, discussing ways to channel any leftover rainwater into makeshift reservoirs. Jonah trailed behind, intrigued by their method of surveying slopes and small gullies. Celia explained that every droplet counted, and if they could guide runoff effectively, they might stretch the benefits of a single storm. Her calm resolve reminded Jonah of how she'd tended him when he first arrived, her hands steady on his feverish brow. He admired that unwavering spirit. Despite the ranch's precarious circumstances, she and Micah pressed on, forging hope from adversity. Jonah felt a surge of gratitude that their steadfastness had enveloped him too. Beneath the blazing sun, with sweat trickling down his neck, he followed them eagerly, determined to learn whatever they could teach. In the afternoon, Jonah took Rumi for a gentle ride around the perimeter of the ranch. He wanted to see if the storm had reached certain low-lying pockets of land. The horse moved confidently, ears twitching at every desert sound, but no longer shying at slight surprises. Now and then, Jonah paused to peer at puddles that shimmered like small mirrors. The heat still radiated fiercely, evaporating the water almost as fast as it had fallen. A pang of concern tightened in Jonah's chest. He wondered how many more storms they'd need before the ranch could truly flourish. Yet each time doubt threatened to consume him, he reminded himself of how far both he and Rumi had come. If a battered boy and a skittish horse could learn to trust again, maybe there was space for bigger miracles. Returning to the yard, Jonah found Celia waiting with a visitor he only vaguely recognized, an older man with a trimmed grey beard and a hat low over his forehead. Celia introduced him as Mr. Calhoun, a rancher from a neighboring county who was scouting for grazing land. Apparently, the meager rain that had graced Jonah's temporary home had bypassed much of Calhoun's territory. "Word travels fast," the man remarked, eyes scanning the property. "Heard you folks got a downpour." His tone implied both curiosity and something else, perhaps envy. Micah joined them, shaking Calhoun's hand with polite caution. Jonah sensed tension flickering beneath the surface as Calhoun eyed the goats, the horses, and the newly repaired fences. He made a few remarks about possible deals, joint grazing, or livestock trades, but Celia deftly steered the conversation away from immediate commitments. The man eventually departed, leaving behind an unsettled hush. That evening, after a supper of beans and tortillas, Micah confided to Jonah and Celia that he worried Calhoun might try to pressure them into selling livestock at a fraction of their worth. "We're on the edge," Micah admitted, brow furrowed. "He knows it, and he'll want to take advantage." Celia's lips thinned in agreement. Jonah listened, heart clenching. He had grown attached not just to the animals, but to the very spirit of the ranch, its resilience and quiet dignity. If Calhoun or anyone else forced them into desperate decisions, the fragile progress they had made could unravel. Before he could dwell on that grim possibility, Celia reminded him to check on the newborn goat twins, and Jonah rose, grateful for the distraction. As he headed outside, stars were already pricking the sky with silver. The night air, though warm, felt gentle against his skin. At the goat pen, the mother dozed while her twins curled into her warmth. Jonah leaned on the fence, letting the calm scene wash over him. A soft nicker from behind made him turn. Rumi stood in the corral's shadows, gaze fixed on Jonah. Smiling, Jonah hopped over to greet his horse. Rumi's muzzle brushed Jonah's palm in a silent hello. Under the moon's faint glow, the two of them walked together along the fence line. Jonah spoke in hushed tones, confiding his worries about Calhoun and the uncertain future of the ranch. He knew Rumi couldn't answer in words, but the horse's steady presence reassured him as much as any human voice could. Eventually, they circled back to the stable, and Jonah lingered, brushing Rumi down until his arms ached pleasantly. He realized, as he closed the stall door, how deeply he yearned to protect this place. Morning brought a swirl of dust in the distance, signaling another visitor. This time it was Carlos, the same friend who had ridden in on a motorcycle weeks before. He greeted Micah with a quick handshake and turned to Jonah with a nod. "Heard about your storm," Carlos said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Thought I'd see if you needed help moving some supplies." The relief in Micah's eyes was obvious. They had been planning to retrieve a load of feed from a far-off depot, but lacked the manpower to do it efficiently. With Carlos pitching in, Jonah and Micah felt more confident making the trip. While Celia stayed behind to manage the ranch, the three loaded up Micah's truck with water canisters, ropes, and empty grain sacks, then set off. The battered engine coughed to life, carrying them away from the ranch's gate under a brightening sky. The drive was long and hot, the sun baking the pickup's metal frame. Yet Jonah found he didn't mind. Sandwiched between Micah and Carlos in the cab, he listened to their easy banter about cattle runs and old-time rodeos. Occasionally, they included Jonah, teasing him good-naturedly about how tough ranch life could be. To Jonah's own surprise, he felt comfortable enough to joke back, even sharing a short anecdote about Rumi's early skittishness. When they arrived at the depot, a dusty warehouse on the outskirts of a sleepy town, they set to work hauling bags of feed onto the truck bed. Sweat drenched their shirts, but Jonah discovered a deep satisfaction in the labor. Every sack loaded meant one more provision for the animals he'd grown to love. By the time they headed back, the truck rode noticeably lower under the weight of the supplies, and Jonah's arms throbbed from exertion. Hope soared in Jonah. By the time Jonah, Micah, and Carlos rumbled back into the ranch's yard with their supply-laden truck, the sun sat low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the fenced enclosures. Jonah hopped out stiffly, his muscles aching from hefting heavy feed sacks, yet a flush of pride colored his cheeks. They'd managed to secure enough provisions to last several weeks if rationed carefully. As Carlos killed the engine, Celia stepped out onto the porch, relief evident in her features. She came forward to help unload, and Jonah felt a renewed surge of belonging in the way she calmly directed them where to stack each bag. Even the goats sounded content, bleating softly under the shade of the lean-to. The ranch, for now, was at peace. When the last sack was tucked away, Carlos clapped Jonah on the shoulder. "You've got a strong back for a kid," he remarked with a friendly grin. Jonah returned the smile, remembering a time not long ago when he could barely stand on his own. Micah thanked Carlos for his help, and they made tentative plans to collaborate again if the ranch needed more hauling. Before leaving, Carlos shot Jonah a glance that held unspoken approval, an acknowledgement that Jonah was no longer just a boy recovering from misfortune, but a capable hand contributing to the ranch's well-being. That night, Jonah found himself restless once more. The swirl of new responsibilities, the concern over neighbors like Calhoun, and the lingering memory of his stepfather's betrayal all jostled in his mind. He quietly left his cot, tiptoeing outside. A soft breeze rustled the thin cotton of his shirt. Overhead, the sky stretched wide and clear, dotted with countless stars. Jonah exhaled, letting the desert's tranquil hush soothe him. Then, as he often did, he made his way to the stable. Rumi lifted his head the moment Jonah appeared, and the horse's soft nicker seemed to whisper welcome. Jonah retrieved a brush from its hook and let himself into the stall. Each stroke across Rumi's coat slowed Jonah's racing thoughts, grounding him in the rhythmic motion, the horse's eyes half closed in pleasure. Jonah couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. Rumi had once flinched at the faintest sign of human touch, terrified by a past no one fully understood. Now, he stood calmly, seeming to trust every gentle gesture. Jonah's throat tightened with gratitude. He remembered the desert's punishing sun, the dryness in his mouth, and the horse's quiet determination to stay with him until help arrived. No matter what else happened, that bond would remain unbreakable. The following morning, Jonah woke to a chorus of bleats from the goat pen. Slipping on his boots, he hurried outside. The two twin kids wobbled eagerly around their mother, apparently hungry for breakfast. Jonah chuckled, lifting small tufts of fresh hay from a bale and placing them where the doe could nudge her offspring to eat. The sight warmed him, but he couldn't ignore a strange prickle at the base of his neck. Turning, he saw Micah by the fence, staring into the distance where a thin plume of dust rose along the main road. A vehicle was approaching, its shape obscured by swirling sand. Jonah's stomach tightened involuntarily. He recalled the day his stepfather had abandoned him, the memory intertwined with the rumble of a departing truck. Within minutes, a sleek SUV emerged, rolling to a stop near the ranch house. A man stepped out, dressed incongruously in polished boots and a crisp shirt, unsuited for desert grime. Celia exchanged a quick glance with Micah before stepping forward to greet the visitor. Jonah hung back, every nerve on alert. Something about the man's self-assured stance and expensive attire reminded Jonah of the type of people who saw ranches as mere stepping stones to profit. Sure enough, once introductions were made, the man announced himself as an associate of Calhoun, come to discuss partnership possibilities. Celia's eyes hardened, though she maintained a polite facade. She explained that she and Micah were happy to hear proposals, but not in any hurry to commit. The man's gaze flicked across the property, seemingly registering each detail: the battered truck, the simple barn, the goats. When his gaze landed on Jonah, it lingered a moment too long. Jonah's gut clenched. He couldn't help feeling that this visitor was taking quiet inventory, seeking leverage in the ranch's obvious financial strain. Micah offered no more than curt civility, leading the man inside to talk. Jonah stood by the fence, heart pounding with unease. He couldn't bear the idea that these negotiations might result in selling off land, animals, or worse, forcing them all away. Rumi whinnied from the corral, as if sensing Jonah's apprehension. Determined to distract himself from his racing thoughts, Jonah made his way to the horse, stroking Rumi's mane. "We won't let them take you," he whispered fiercely. Rumi nudged his shoulder, and Jonah pressed his cheek to the horse's neck, drawing comfort from that steady warmth. Eventually, the man departed in his SUV, leaving a wake of tension in his dust. Celia and Micah stood on the porch, conversing in low, urgent tones. Jonah approached, shoulders tight. Micah glanced at him, face drawn. "He wants to buy a controlling interest in the ranch," Micah said flatly. "It claims he can bring in irrigation and capital to fix our problems, but we'd lose autonomy." Celia nodded, arms folded. "And it's not just that. He implied we'd need to expand into areas we don't agree with, commercial feedlots, things that go against how we want to run this place." Jonah's pulse pounded. Even in his short time here, he knew the ranch's identity rested on humane practices and a respect for every creature under its care. Though Jonah was still technically a guest, he spoke up, voice trembling with conviction. "You can't let him do that," he pleaded. "This place, it gave me a chance when I had nowhere else. You've done that for every animal you take in. If someone else runs it, what if they only see numbers and profit?" Micah's features softened, and Celia exhaled. "We're not selling our souls," Celia reassured him, though the faint tremor in her tone hinted at how much she felt the weight of this decision. "But we need alternatives, and fast, or we might not have a choice." Over the next few days, the ranch slogged through a haze of indecision. Though recent rain had offered temporary relief, the well levels remained critically low, and finances were tight. Celia spent long hours hunched over a ledger, muttering about overdue bills. Micah scoured local listings for ranch hands or partial investors who might respect their vision. Jonah did what he could, doubling his efforts with chores, rationing feed carefully, and making sure the goats and horses stayed healthy. Yet a sense of impending crisis loomed. Each night, he found himself at Rumi's stall, quietly whispering his fears into the horse's ear. Then one afternoon, an unexpected commotion broke the uneasy lull. The old windmill clanked furiously in a sudden gust of wind, and Jonah dashed outside to see Celia sprinting toward the main gate, where a dusty pickup had just screeched to a halt. A wiry stranger leapt out, shouting for help. "There's been an accident up the road," he cried, voice cracking with alarm. "Truck flipped, driver pinned." Jonah's heart kicked. He watched Micah grab rope and a first aid kit, Celia jumping into the passenger seat of her own vehicle, calling for Jonah to follow. The next minutes blurred in adrenaline. Jonah found himself squeezed in the back of Celia's pickup as she sped along the rough road, the frantic stranger pointing directions. They soon reached a patch of highway where a large truck lay on its side, shattered glass strewn across the asphalt. A figure was trapped inside, groaning in pain. Micah and Celia wasted no time, carefully breaking open the remaining window while Jonah hovered, scanning for anything he could do. The man inside was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, his breaths ragged. Jonah felt a jolt of nauseating familiarity. He had once been on the brink of death, waiting for someone to save him. Now, in a startling reversal, he found himself on the rescue side of tragedy. With combined effort, they dragged the injured driver out. Celia, who possessed rudimentary medical skills, checked his vitals and did her best to staunch the bleeding. Jonah fetched water and a blanket from the back of the pickup, trembling as he knelt beside the man. His gaze flicked to the license plate of the overturned truck, a different state's number, likely a passing traveler. Relief brushed Jonah's mind. This was no ghost from his past, yet he couldn't shake the chill that ran down his spine. Eventually, an ambulance arrived, and they handed the driver over to professional care. The paramedics praised their quick response, remarking that the man might have lost too much blood otherwise. Jonah watched the red lights fade into the distance, heart still hammering. That evening, the ranch felt subdued. They had saved a stranger, just as Jonah had once been saved. Micah offered a brief squeeze of Jonah's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement that they had done something vital. Even the goats were oddly quiet, as though the day's drama lingered in the air. Jonah retreated to the stable, where Rumi waited, ears pricked forward. Gently, Jonah took the horse's bridle and led him into the corral. Tension still knotted Jonah's muscles. He needed to ride, to feel the rhythm of hooves and the desert wind on his face. Mounting up, he urged Rumi to a canter around the perimeter. The horse responded with fluid grace, unburdened by human worries. Jonah's pulse slowed, each stride reminding him that life could be tragic, beautiful, and unpredictable all at once. After a few laps, Jonah dismounted. Leading Rumi to the fence, he watched dusk drape the ranch in violet shadow. In that hush, Jonah whispered a prayer for the injured traveler, for the precarious ranch, for Micah and Celia, and for Rumi, the horse who had shown him what survival looked like. He gazed at the horizon, imagining an uncertain future, but feeling a flicker of faith that, whatever happened, they would face it together. At last, he guided Rumi back inside, leaving the corral gates latched. Tomorrow would bring its own trials, and the ranch needed every ounce of collective strength. Though Jonah's old wounds hadn't fully vanished, he felt them healing at the edges, renewed by purpose and gratitude. By dawn the next morning, the ranch lay still beneath a sky streaked with fragile pinks and blues. Jonah woke with a lingering heaviness in his chest, remnants of yesterday's rush to save the injured traveler. He pushed aside the thin blanket on his makeshift cot, quickly pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The morning air carried a surprising chill. Summer's heat had relented, if only briefly. For a moment, he paused to gaze across the property. The goats milled about, their newborn kids tottering at their mother's sides. Somewhere near the paddock, he heard Rumi's low nicker, and his heart lifted. That horse's presence had become a steady compass, guiding Jonah through worries he still wasn't sure how to articulate. He made a quick stop at the goat enclosure. The twin kids scrambled around, nibbling on errant tufts of hay. Their mother looked up at Jonah, gave a soft bleat, then returned to her grazing. Jonah felt a faint smile pull at his mouth. New life continued here, even in the face of adversity. It reassured him that no matter how precarious things got, living creatures found ways to persist. He knelt to refill a water bucket, mindful of each precious drop. The ranch's well levels were still a concern, though that brief storm had bought them time. He patted the side of the enclosure and headed for the stable, eager for a moment with Rumi before morning chores consumed him. Inside, Rumi greeted Jonah with a bump of his muzzle. Jonah slipped the latch and entered, letting the horse sniff at his hands. Over the past few days, Jonah had noticed a new confidence in Rumi, especially when confronted with unfamiliar faces or sounds. If a sudden noise startled him, he no longer bolted or trembled as he once did. He turned instead to Jonah, ears swiveling but posture steady. Jonah felt a swell of pride that mirrored how he, too, had been changing. Traumatic memories still lurked in the corners of his mind, but he sensed they were less powerful now, like shadows retreating under the light of new experiences. He brushed Rumi's coat in gentle strokes, humming a tune under his breath. The horse leaned into the brush, eyes half closed. Jonah remembered a night not so long ago when he feared he'd never see a dawn again. Now, each sunrise brought him a step further from that darkness. Brushing finished, he retrieved a halter and led Rumi out of the stable. They walked toward the corral, where Jonah guided the horse through a few ground exercises that Micah had shown him. Rumi's ears pricked forward, as though eager to move. Jonah ran the rope around small cones, prompting Rumi to step carefully. Each time the horse followed a direction without flinching, Jonah felt a quiet thrill. After half an hour, Jonah patted Rumi's shoulder and released him into the corral to graze on the scattered tufts of green that still clung to life. Some of the grass had bounced back thanks to the rain, though most of the pasture remained brown and brittle. A call from the house broke Jonah's concentration. Celia stood on the porch, beckoning him over. Her expression was pinched, as if she'd received unsettling news. Jonah's heart lurched. He jogged across the yard, boots kicking up pale dust. "What is it?" he asked the moment he climbed the porch steps. Celia handed him a short note, hastily scrawled. Micah had gone into town to speak with a bank officer about a possible loan extension. The note said the conversation had not gone well. Micah planned to stay in town a bit longer, seeking out alternative lenders or perhaps small investors. Celia exhaled. "He told me not to worry, but you know how that goes," she murmured. "If we can't work out a new arrangement, we might be forced to accept outside help we don't trust." Jonah lowered his gaze. He recalled the man in the SUV and the uneasy feeling of being sized up. Calhoun and his associates were circling, hungry for a chance to pounce. Despite his youth, Jonah understood that money had a way of twisting people's intentions. The ranch had become his sanctuary, and the idea of losing it to strangers hit him like a gut punch. "There has to be another way," Jonah said softly, folding the note in his hand. Celia gave a weary shrug. "Micah's resourceful, but we're running out of time." The hours dragged. Jonah busied himself with chores, repairing a loose hinge on the stable door, refilling water troughs, and sorting the new feed supplies. Celia alternated between phone calls inside and pacing the porch. By late afternoon, a pang of dread settled in Jonah's stomach. Still, Micah had not returned. The sun began to sink, painting the horizon in fiery gold. Jonah finished grooming one of the older horses, a mild-tempered bay named Meadow, and trudged back to the house. He found Celia seated at the kitchen table, head in her hands. A single lamp cast a weak glow over the ledger she'd been studying. The numbers clearly offered no comfort. Jonah crossed to her side. "Celia," he began hesitantly, "what if... I'm not sure how, but maybe I can work somehow, earn money from somewhere else to help." He thought of the ranch jobs he'd once heard about in passing, or possibly traveling to the next town for part-time tasks. Celia gave him a tired smile and shook her head. "Your help here is invaluable already. Besides, we need more than a trickle of extra income. We need a safety net, enough to cover pending debts before they bury us." As if on cue, the roar of an engine reached them. Jonah leapt to the door, heart pounding. Micah's truck rumbled into the yard, headlights carving twin beams through the dusk. Jonah and Celia hurried outside to meet him, the evening air thick with tension. When Micah climbed out, Jonah's spirits dipped at the sight of his drawn expression. He slammed the truck door harder than necessary, scrubbing a hand across his forehead. "No luck," he muttered. "Banks closed its doors to us, and the local credit union won't risk it either. They say we're too far behind." Celia's face went ashen. Jonah hovered, uncertain whether to speak. Micah paced a short line in the dust, finally turning to them. Calhoun's people made a new offer. His voice trembled with barely contained anger. They want to buy out half our land, convert it for commercial grazing. It'd wipe a chunk of our debt, but... He broke off, unable to finish the thought. Jonah's throat tightened as he pictured bulldozers and feedlots replacing the quiet barns, the stable, the space where goats and horses roamed. Celia let out a ragged breath. I won't watch them strip this place of everything we've built. A hush settled. The ranch's nighttime sounds crept in, a horse stomping in its stall, a goat's muffled bleat, the hiss of a desert breeze. Finally, Micah spoke again. They gave us a tight deadline, 2 weeks. If we don't accept by then, the bank moves forward with foreclosure. His voice wavered on that final word. Jonah felt tears burn behind his eyes. He spun away, focusing on the distant silhouette of Rumi in the corral. Could they really be just days from losing all they had fought for? Later, Jonah sank onto the top rail of Rumi's fence. The night sky spread above him. Stars glimmered in a silent tapestry, as if indifferent to human woes. He heard footsteps and glanced back to find Celia and Micah approaching, their faces solemn. Celia reached out to run a hand over Jonah's shoulder. We'll do everything in our power to save this place, she said quietly. Micah nodded in agreement. We're not giving up yet. Jonah swallowed, nodding in return. He remembered how, in the desert, he'd clung to life despite the hopelessness of being stranded. If there was a time to muster that same tenacity, it was now. In the following days, the ranch buzzed with a new kind of urgency. Celia took phone calls from dawn until dusk, reaching out to old contacts, searching for any rescue that might surface. Some ranching grant, a philanthropic group, or a private benefactor with kinder intentions than Calhoun. Micah penned letters to local newspapers, describing the threat to their livelihood and calling on the community for support. Meanwhile, Jonah threw himself into caring for the animals. He spent extra time with the goats, ensuring their enclosures were clean and well-maintained. He brushed and exercised the older horses, double-checking that each remained fit and uninjured. His body ached each night, but the routine kept him from drowning in fear. Word of the ranch's predicament began to trickle through the county. A few small-scale ranchers stopped by with encouraging words or small donations of feed. A teacher from a nearby town called, asking if her students could organize a fundraiser. Though these gestures touched Jonah's heart, the scale of their debt loomed too large. Night after night, Celia and Micah pored over financial statements, faces etched with worry. One evening, Jonah woke in the dark to fetch water and glimpsed light under the office door. Peeking in, he saw Micah slumped over a stack of paperwork, asleep with a pen still clutched in his hand. Celia gently draped a blanket over him, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Despite the tension, life pressed on. The newborn goats were thriving, eagerly bounding around their mother. Jonah continued Rumi's training, venturing further into the desert for short rides. He found solace in those moments where the horizon stretched empty and silent except for the rhythmic thud of hooves. Rumi seemed to sense Jonah's swirling emotions, responding with careful steadiness whenever Jonah's posture tensed or his grip on the reins faltered. During one particularly still dawn, Jonah rode Rumi up a gentle slope overlooking the ranch. From that vantage, the hodgepodge of buildings looked humble, the corrals a patchwork of fences. Yet the ranch felt so alive, each animal and structure part of a shared heartbeat. Jonah inhaled sharply, pushing back tears. He could not imagine losing it. At the bottom of the slope, he spotted something unexpected. a tall figure in a familiar hat. As he guided Rumi closer, Jonah realized it was Carlos, pacing near the corral gate. Jonah dismounted, curious. Carlos turned with a grim expression. "Heard the news," he said quietly. "Micah told me about the foreclosure threat." Jonah nodded. "We're close to losing everything." Carlos sighed. "I might have a lead on a rancher up north who's retired and might be willing to invest, but it's a long shot. Do you trust me to try?" Surprised and grateful, Jonah managed a shaky smile. Any help would mean a lot. Carlos stayed for the afternoon, conferring with Micah and Celia. They pieced together a plan. Carlos would leave the next day, traveling to speak in person with the potential investor. If successful, they could secure a partnership that respected the ranch's ethos. That evening, as they shared a sparse dinner, a flicker of hope lit the air. Jonah watched Micah's shoulders loosen, and Celia mustered a faint smile. They knew it was tenuous, but at least they had an alternative to Calhoun's creeping grasp. As dawn broke, Jonah helped Carlos load his motorcycle with the documents Micah had compiled: financial statements, ranch valuations, photographs of the property, and personal letters about their practices. "Show them we aren't just numbers," Micah advised, his voice tight with emotion. Carlos nodded. "I'll do my best," he promised. Jonah shook his hand, gratitude mingling with anxiety. Watching Carlos ride away, he silently prayed for a positive outcome. 2 days ticked by without word. Each hour felt heavier than the last. Jonah tried to stay busy, but his mind kept looping. What if Carlos failed? What if the prospective investor laughed off their plight? Calhoun's deadline loomed, a thundercloud at the edge of an already dark sky. Jonah dreaded the possibility that soon the ranch might be carved up, its spirit lost. Celia and Micah carried on in stoic determination, but their exhaustion was palpable. Late on the second night, Jonah lay awake, haunted by a memory of the desert where his stepfather had left him. The same helplessness licked at his insides. He swallowed hard, reminding himself that no matter what happened, he had allies now. He wasn't alone. Finally, on the third evening, a roar of an engine broke the tense silence. Jonah raced outside to find Carlos pulling up, dust coating his jacket. From the slump of his shoulders, Jonah feared the worst. Micah and Celia joined them, dread tightening all their features. Carlos removed his helmet, his face grim and damp with sweat. He began, then paused, his expression flashing uncertain. "They need more time. They want to see the ranch in person, maybe next week." A hush descended. Micah bowed his head. Celia let out a shaky breath. Next week was too late. Calhoun's deadline came sooner. Jonah's heart seized. Carlos stared at the ground. "I tried," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." Micah patted his friend on the back, gratitude and sorrow mingling in that gesture. Celia blinked rapidly, as though holding back tears. Jonah took a step away, unable to face the raw disappointment etched on their faces. He felt Rumi's comforting presence not far off, but for once, the horse's nearness offered only a dull pang of regret. Overhead, stars winked in the night sky, indifferent to human tragedy. No one spoke as the group wandered toward the porch, weighed down by the bitter knowledge that hope had slipped beyond reach. Jonah peered over his shoulder, toward the stable and the shadowy corral. The ranch had saved him, now it needed saving, and he had no idea how to provide it. He clenched his fists, longing for a miracle, some sign that all was not yet lost. But the night answered only with silence. Morning brought no respite from the heavy pall that had fallen over the ranch. Jonah awoke to the usual sounds, goats braying, distant snorts from the horses. But now each familiar noise seemed colored by the fear that all of this could vanish. He forced himself out of bed and went outside, pulling on his boots with grim determination. If the world was about to close in on them, he reasoned. He wouldn't waste the time they had left. He headed straight to Rumi's corral, half expecting the horse to sense his desperation. But Rumi merely tossed his head, stepping forward to greet Jonah with a gentle bump of the muzzle, as though to say, "We face this together." Jonah spent the early hours tending the animals. He gave fresh hay to the horses, checked the newborn goats, and then refilled every water trough. With the well precariously low, each splash felt extravagant, but Micah had insisted they keep the animals cared for until the very end. Glancing toward the house, Jonah saw Celia on the porch, talking on her phone in hushed, agitated tones. He guessed she was making one last round of calls, searching for any hint of salvation. The gloom in her posture told him she was hitting dead ends. A pang of helplessness wove through him, stirring memories of lying feverish in the desert, convinced no one would come. But then, someone did. Maybe there was still a chance for a miracle here too. At mid-morning, Micah emerged from the house and walked heavily across the yard to join Jonah by the goat pen. Without speaking, the two fell into a familiar rhythm, checking fences and scanning for any sign of broken boards. Eventually, Micah paused, leaning on a gate. "I owe you an explanation, son," he said quietly. Jonah, startled by the raw regret in Micah's voice, just nodded. "I've been running this place on razor-thin margins for years," Micah went on. "Celia stuck by me, and we tried to make it work. When you showed up, we gained a sense of purpose again, like we weren't just failing alone. But now..." He trailed off, eyes clouded. Jonah's throat constricted. He wanted to argue, to say it wasn't over, yet the words stuck, refused to form. They were startled by Celia calling from the porch. "Micah!" she shouted. "There's someone here!" Jonah and Micah exchanged puzzled looks. Another visitor, so soon after Carlos's return. They hurried toward the gate, where a battered station wagon had parked. Stepping out was a woman in her 50s, hair pulled back, wearing a serious expression. Celia greeted her uncertainly, and the woman introduced herself as Teresa, a regional journalist who had caught wind of the ranch's plight from a neighbor. "I'm looking to do a human interest piece," she said. "Heard about the boy who was rescued from the desert and the horse that saved him." "Also heard about the foreclosure threat," Jonah blinked, uncomfortable at being the topic of possible headlines. But Teresa's demeanor seemed earnest rather than sensational. Maybe, he thought, shining a light on their story could muster public sympathy. Micah spoke with her in low tones, glancing occasionally at Jonah. He explained how Jonah had arrived half dead, how Rumi had played an unlikely hero, and how the ranch's ideals revolved around caring for animals that others deemed worthless. Teresa nodded, scribbling in a small notepad. She asked if she could see the horse. Celia hesitated, but Micah agreed, leading Teresa toward the corral. Jonah followed, nerves prickling. He half expected Rumi to shy away from a stranger carrying a camera and scribbling notes, but to Jonah's surprise, the horse remained calm. Perhaps all those hours of gentle training had bolstered Rumi's trust in people. At least when Jonah stood beside him, Teresa snapped a few photos, capturing Rumi's dark eyes and the faint scars on his flanks. She interviewed Jonah next, voice soft but persistent. "How did you survive out there? What were your thoughts when the horse showed up?" He struggled to put it into words, halting at first. Eventually, he described the blur of fever, the sense of utter abandonment, and the warmth he felt when Rumi refused to leave him. "I wouldn't be here if not for him," Jonah concluded, cheeks burning with emotion. Teresa nodded, her eyes carrying empathy. Then she pivoted to the ranch's future, pressing Micah and Celia for details. They were honest about the looming deadline and the fear of losing everything to corporate interests. She wrote quickly, brow knit in concentration. Before leaving, Teresa took a few final pictures of Jonah standing with Rumi, Celia and Micah in the background. She promised to get the piece out as soon as possible. "If nothing else, maybe your story will move some hearts," she said. Jonah mustered a smile, though doubt shadowed his thoughts. Would an article be enough to stave off a foreclosure? As she drove away, a strange sense of anticipation flickered. Jonah guessed they would soon see how powerful words could be. That afternoon, the ranch resumed its tense routine. Micah busied himself in the barn. Celia made more phone calls, and Jonah wandered about, checking each corner of the property as though memorizing it before something terrible changed it forever. The goats provided a small respite, their kids gambling around in wide-eyed curiosity. Each time Jonah heard their soft bleating, he felt a bittersweet ache. These creatures had no idea how fragile their home had become. That evening, a hush draped the ranch as dusk settled. Jonah found Celia in the kitchen, rummaging for something in a cabinet. "Just trying to put together a decent supper," she murmured. Her voice sounded wobbly, and Jonah gently placed a hand on her arm. She blinked back tears, forcing a smile. "We'll be all right," she said, though she sounded far from convinced. The next morning, Micah turned on the small radio in the living room, hoping for local news or any mention of Teresa's article. Jonah went about chores with the radio's crackle in the background, tension coiling in his gut. After lunch, a neighbor drove up, waving a copy of the regional paper. "Saw your story," he called out from his truck window. Jonah's heart fluttered. Micah grabbed the paper, flipping it open to a spread with black and white photos. There, under the headline, "A Ranch on the Brink," was an image of Rumi nuzzling Jonah, with a shorter piece focusing on Jonah's miraculous survival. Teresa's words glowed with empathy, describing the ranch's mission and the threat it faced. Celia read it aloud, voice quavering at parts about second chances for both boy and horse. Jonah listened with cheeks flushed, torn between embarrassment and hope. Then something unexpected happened. The phone started ringing. First, a local mother wanting to know if her child could visit the goats. Then a retired rancher asking if he could drop by to see the property. Micah answered wearily, expecting more empty curiosity, but found the caller genuinely concerned, asking how he might help. Celia scribbled notes, potential donors, random well-wishers, even a small rescue organization that offered to adopt some of the older horses to relieve expenses. Within days, letters began arriving, envelopes with short messages of encouragement, a few containing modest checks. Jonah was stunned. He'd never experienced such outpouring from strangers, let alone for a place he thought the world had forgotten. Despite the modest surge of goodwill, the clock kept ticking. Calhoun's deadline loomed, each day feeling like a grain of sand slipping through an hourglass. Still, the ranch persevered. Jonah noticed Micah's shoulders had lifted fractionally. Celia no longer wore despair like a heavy cloak. They pinned each new letter to a bulletin board in the office, calling it the Wall of Hope. Some notes were from ordinary families who said they'd read Jonah's story and wanted to send a few dollars. Others came from faraway ranchers who knew the hardships of desert land. One letter held a promise of a one-time donation that nearly covered half a monthly payment, lifting Jonah's spirits for hours. A week passed in this precarious balance. Carlos returned, intrigued by the newfound momentum, though he cautioned them not to rely solely on the article's ripple effect. "We still need a bigger investment," he warned. "Goodwill helps, but we're facing real numbers." Micah nodded, lips pressed into a firm line. He hadn't forgotten. The final day arrived, the very one Calhoun had marked as the ranch's cutoff. Celia paced the porch, phone in hand, glancing every few minutes at the dusty driveway. "Will they come in person?" Jonah asked, voice trembling. She shrugged. "I don't know, but we need to be ready." Morning slid into midday, and midday into late afternoon, with no sign of Calhoun's associates. Micah tried calling the bank to see if anything had changed, but no one answered. Tension suffocated each breath. Jonah checked on Rumi, grooming him meticulously, as though preparing for some official inspection. He wasn't sure what else to do. When the sun finally dipped, painting the sky in deep orange, a lone vehicle turned onto the ranch road, an older sedan, kicking up dust in a weary approach. Jonah, Celia, and Micah exchanged looks, expecting the worst. The car parked. Out stepped a woman in her 40s, balancing a portfolio under her arm. In halting words, she introduced herself as a representative from the lending department of a regional co-op that had read the article. "We saw the local coverage," she said, looking around at the ranch's humble structures. "It made us reconsider your loan appeal." "I'm here to conduct a quick assessment." Jonah's heart hammered. Could this be real? Celia and Micah led the woman on a short tour. Jonah followed at a respectful distance, listening as the woman asked about livestock care, water management, feed supply, and the ranch's vision. Rumi stood calm in the corral, as though sensing the gravity of the moment. The woman paused to stroke the horse's muzzle, smiling faintly when Rumi stayed still. After an hour, they reconvened at the porch. The co-op representative flipped through her notes, then inhaled. "I'm impressed," she said. "I can't promise a miracle, but our board is meeting tomorrow. If we approve an emergency loan, you'll have enough to pay off the immediate debts and avoid foreclosure, assuming the bank concurs." Micah's voice cracked in gratitude. Celia pressed a hand over her mouth, tears brimming. Jonah's knees felt weak with relief. The woman offered a handshake. "I should have an answer within 24 hours. If all goes well, the sale to Calhoun might be unnecessary." Then she headed back to her car, leaving them on the porch, stunned by this sudden glimmer of hope. Darkness fell swiftly, but the tension that had crushed them seemed to lift like a receding storm. In the stable, Jonah offered Rumi a final brush for the day, hands trembling from the rush of emotions. Though nothing was guaranteed, he felt a wave of optimism that rivaled the first time he'd opened his eyes after the desert rescue. As Rumi nuzzled him, Jonah whispered, "We're almost there." The horse snorted softly. Closing his eyes, Jonah pictured the ranch continuing on. No bulldozers, no forced sell-off, and the idea filled him with a quiet, determined joy. If tomorrow brought the reprieve they needed, it would be another testament to what faith and perseverance could accomplish, for humans and animals alike. The next morning dawned with a hush of expectation across Desert Bell Ranch. Jonah woke at first light, too anxious to sleep any longer, and dressed quickly. Outside, the eastern sky blushed in faint pinks and oranges, reflecting on the silent corrals. The co-op's board was due to meet that day, possibly deciding the ranch's future. Though no phone call had arrived yet, Jonah clung to the hope sparked by the woman's visit. He glanced toward Rumi's stall, taking comfort in the knowledge that the horse was close by. If luck favored them, the ranch would survive, and both man and beast could remain together in peace. As Jonah stepped onto the porch, he found Celia already awake, clutching a chipped mug of coffee. Her gaze drifted toward the driveway, where any visitor might appear with news. Micah emerged behind her, his movements heavy with fatigue. A bowl of oatmeal waited on the table, but no one seemed eager to eat. They exchanged subdued greetings, each silent in their own anxiety. Jonah tried to muster optimism, reminding himself that they had persevered through so much already. Today, he prayed, would bring the break they so desperately needed. A couple of hours slipped by without a phone call or knock at the door. Jonah busied himself with chores, brushing Rumi and leading him around the corral to ease the tension coiled in his gut. Micah tried tinkering with a bulky generator, while Celia wrote a final letter to the bank, pleading for more time. Around midday, the air turned oppressively still, as though even the wind dared not disturb their vigil. Jonah couldn't help but recall the silent terror of lying in the desert, waiting for help. Then, at last, the shrill ring of the phone pierced the silence. Jonah and Celia dashed inside, nearly colliding in their haste. Micah snatched the receiver. His chest rose and fell as he listened. "Yes, this is he," he said finally. The seconds stretched. Celia gripped Jonah's arm, her knuckles white. Jonah's heart drummed so loudly he could barely hear. Then, Micah's tight features relaxed. "Thank you," he whispered, voice catching. "Yes, we accept." He lowered the phone, turning to Celia and Jonah with eyes brimming with relief. "They approved the loan," he breathed. "We have a lifeline." Celia let out a trembling laugh, tears shining on her cheeks. Jonah felt a surge of triumph so strong it nearly buckled his knees. They weren't losing the ranch, at least not now. Standing together in the cramped living room, they embraced, a family forged by hope and necessity. In that moment, every doubt that had haunted them dissolved in relief. Celia immediately called the bank with the good news, finalizing the arrangement that would keep Calhoun's deal at bay. Meanwhile, Micah sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Jonah stood nearby, heart thudding in exhilaration. He recalled the bleak hours of defeat and how swiftly fate could turn. Stepping outside, he gazed at the yard with fresh eyes. This was no longer an impending graveyard of dreams. It was a future still unfolding. Though relief spread quickly, the ranch's challenges weren't all solved. The loan only bought time and a fresh chance to stabilize. Still, the moment felt like a miraculous reprieve. Over the next days, Celia and Micah drafted new budgets, exploring ways to refine their approach without sacrificing the ranch's core values. Jonah plunged into work with renewed vigor, caring for the animals and learning more about breeding and training. Each dawn felt like a triumph in itself. People who read the article continued to visit, donating small funds or volunteering labor. A local feed store offered discounts on supplies, citing the ranch's story as an inspiration. Meanwhile, Jonah marveled at how swiftly gratitude replaced despair. He sometimes thought of his stepfather, remembering the venomous words that had shaped his sense of worthlessness, yet here he was needed. Even more, he was cherished by a community that had embraced him and the horse who saved his life. Determined to express his gratitude, Jonah poured energy into furthering Rumi's training. He practiced short rides at a gentle trot, gradually introducing small obstacles to build the horse's confidence. On weekends, Micah watched from the fence, offering calm advice. Each time Rumi cleared a tiny hurdle, Jonah's face lit with pride. The horse no longer bore the posture of one haunted by ghosts. His eyes shone with curiosity, not fear. Their bond had become something that transcended survival, a partnership forged in shared perseverance. One late afternoon, Jonah led Rumi out beyond the corral, heading toward the same gently sloping rise where he once surveyed the ranch in desperation. This time, his chest lifted with a quiet assurance. At the crest, he turned Rumi to face home. The fences, stables, and low-slung house lay bathed in golden sun. He remembered how close they came to losing it all. With a gentle squeeze of his knees, he guided Rumi forward, weaving an easy path across the dusty ground, heart thrumming in grateful harmony. Slowly, the ranch's future began to solidify. The co-op's loan came through officially, and Micah managed to renegotiate payment terms with the bank. Calhoun's associates, sensing their leverage had evaporated, slunk away without further demands. Encouraged by the wave of support, Celia organized a modest open house, welcoming neighbors to see the animals and learn about the ranch's philosophy. Jonah stood proudly by the fence as visitors met Rumi, the fabled horse from the newspaper story. An unexpected hush fell when one guest approached Jonah directly, eyes brimming with emotion. She introduced herself as Sarah, the sister of the traveler they'd helped rescue after his truck flipped. "My brother's recovering," she said, voice shaking. "He told me this ranch saved him, just like it saved you." Jonah blinked back sudden tears, uncertain how to respond. He managed a trembling smile. "We're all just doing our best," he whispered. Sarah held out an envelope, explaining it contained a small donation from grateful family members. Jonah's chest clenched with gratitude as he accepted it. After she left, he slipped away from the crowd, finding Rumi in a quieter corner. Standing beside the horse, Jonah stroked Rumi's mane, remembering that day in the desert. His voice wavered with emotion. "You saved me," he murmured. "Now we've saved this ranch too. Maybe that's what we were meant to do." For a long moment, Jonah simply stood there, hands resting on Rumi's neck. A light breeze ruffled the horse's mane, and Jonah closed his eyes, letting relief and gratitude flood through him. Footsteps approached quietly. He glanced up to see Micah and Celia, standing side by side, watching with a mix of pride and fondness. The ranch they loved had weathered another storm. Jonah drew a deep breath, thinking of how far he'd come from that boy abandoned in the desert. In the weeks that followed, Jonah settled into a gentle routine that felt like home. He helped Micah repair fences, rode Rumi along the ranch's boundary, and took on small duties that made the ranch stronger. Some mornings, he found himself recalling his mother's voice, urging him to be brave. He realized she would have approved of this life, filled with hard work and honest bonds. Over time, the sting of betrayal lost its bite. Replaced by a powerful sense of belonging, Rumi thrived as well, galloping with a grace that hinted at limitless possibility. Whenever Jonah glanced at the scars on the horse's flank, he no longer saw defeat but victory over despair. No matter what trials lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by loyalty that transcended words. Desert Bell Ranch had endured, and so had they. Hope rose like the horse's